Britain built council estates rather well in theory. Decent homes for working families, indoor bathrooms, gardens for children and green space and fresh air after decades of cramped terraces and bomb-damaged slums. The whole point was dignity. But some of those estates were built in places so remote, so disconnected, and so strange that the people who moved in found themselves more isolated than they had been in the streets they left behind. We begin in Lancashire with a town that was designed from scratch and still managed to make no sense. Skelmersdale was designated a new town in 1961. The purpose was straightforward. Liverpool was overcrowded. Families needed moving out. The Development Corporation selected a site roughly 13 miles northeast of Liverpool and set about building an entirely new community for a projected population of around 80,000. What they built was something no resident had asked for. The road system was designed exclusively for cars. There is no traditional high street. The residential areas sit behind looping distributor roads that circle back on themselves without logic. Taxi drivers from outside the town routinely get lost. Residents who have lived there for decades describe giving directions by landmarks rather than street names because the street names follow no pattern anyone can memorize. Beneath the roads, a network of concrete pedestrian underpasses was built to separate foot traffic from vehicles. The idea looked clean on a planning drawing. In practice, the underpasses flooded regularly, attracted crime, and cut off one neighborhood from the next. Walking through Skelmersdale at night meant walking through a series of concrete tunnels that most residents avoided entirely. The town was built with almost no public houses. For a community transplanted from Liverpool, where the pub was the front room of social life, this was not an oversight. It was an ideology. The planners believed new towns should discourage drinking culture. What they discouraged instead was community. The Concourse shopping centre served as the only central gathering point, and when retailers began leaving in the 1980s, even that disappeared. The factories that were supposed to provide employment arrived and then left. Courtaulds closed. Other firms followed. By the 2000s, unemployment in Skelmersdale sat well above the Lancashire average. The town that was built to give Liverpool families a fresh start became the place those families could not leave because there was nothing to leave for. Heading northeast to Tyneside, we find a place where the future arrived, failed, and was demolished within a single generation. Killingworth was planned in the 1960s as a modernist township on the outskirts of Newcastle. The original design centered on a megastructure of towers, elevated walkways, and enclosed shopping decks. The architects envisioned a self-contained community where residents would never need to touch the ground. Cars below, people above. The future made concrete. The future lasted roughly 20 years. The towers developed structural problems. The elevated walkways became windswept corridors that residents refused to use. The enclosed shopping area felt threatening after dark. By the 1980s, the township centre was being demolished. The replacement housing that went up afterwards was conventional. Terraces, semi-detached homes, front doors at street level. Everything the original planners had rejected as old-fashioned turned out to be what people actually wanted. Residents who lived in the original towers describe a particular kind of disorientation. You could see Newcastle from your window, but reaching it required a bus journey that took over 40 minutes. The estate sat 5 miles from the city centre, but felt like 50. When the demolition crews moved in, some residents watched from the replacement houses across the road. They had moved 200 yards and felt like they had moved to a different country. South to London now, and to an estate so visually striking that Stanley Kubrick used it as his vision of a dystopian future before the first residents had finished unpacking. Thamesmead was built from 1967 onwards on the Plumstead and Erith marshes in southeast London. The Greater London Council designed it for a population of 60,000. Brutalist concrete blocks rose from reclaimed marshland. An artificial lake system served as both amenity and flood defence. The geometry was imposing. Long slab blocks reflected in still water. Concrete walkways connecting buildings at upper levels. It looked like nowhere else in London. Kubrick filmed A Clockwork Orange there in 1971. The association has never left. For decades, Thamesmead was the estate people recognised from a film about ultra-violence, which did nothing for the community trying to build a life there. The deeper problem was geography. Thamesmead had no railway station for most of its existence. The nearest underground stop was miles away. Bus services connected to Woolwich and Abbey Wood, but journey times into central London could exceed 90 minutes. For an estate inside the Greater London boundary, this level of isolation was remarkable. Peabody Housing Association took over management and launched regeneration plans, but residents on community forums still describe the same core problem. You are in London. You do not feel like you are in London. The city exists around you, but not for you. Crossing into the West Midlands, we reach Chelmsley Wood. Built from 1965 onwards to absorb families from Birmingham's slum clearances, the estate sits on the far side of the M6 motorway in the borough of Solihull. This administrative detail matters. Solihull is one of the most prosperous boroughs in England. Wards like Knowle and Dorridge are affluent, leafy and comfortable. Chelmsley Wood is none of these things. The estate was separated from Birmingham by the motorway and from Solihull town centre by miles of dual carriageway. Residents describe a feeling of belonging to neither city. Birmingham cleared them out. Solihull did not want them. The deprivation statistics for Chelmsley Wood wards sit at the opposite end of the index from the rest of the borough. Life expectancy, educational attainment, and employment rates all diverge sharply within the same local authority boundary. It is possible to drive 15 minutes from one of the most deprived communities in the West Midlands to one of the wealthiest without crossing a single borough line. Now we shift to places that should never have been built where they were built. The planners had maps. They could see the contour lines, the distances, the absence of roads. They built there anyway. We begin on a mountaintop in South Wales. Penrhys sits on a hilltop ridge between the Rhondda Fawr and Rhondda Fach valleys. Before the council arrived, this site was a medieval pilgrimage destination. A statue of the Virgin Mary drew visitors for centuries. The views from the top stretch for miles across the valleys. In the late 1960s, Rhondda Borough Council built a council estate on this hilltop. System-built concrete blocks went up on a site accessible by a single steep road that switchbacks up the hillside. When it snowed, the road became impassable. Elderly residents could not get down to the valley for shopping or medical appointments. Ambulances struggled to reach the top in winter. Deliveries failed. The estate sat above the cloud line on bad days, literally cut off from the communities below. The buildings began failing almost immediately. Condensation, damp, cracking concrete panels. By the 1990s, demolition had begun. The towers came down. The population, which had peaked at over 3,000, dropped to a few hundred. The Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation ranked the area among the most deprived communities in Wales for decades running. What remains on the hilltop now is a smaller, low-rise development. The medieval pilgrim statue has been restored, but residents still describe the fundamental problem that no regeneration scheme has solved. You are on top of a mountain. Everything you need is at the bottom. East across the Pennines to the edge of Liverpool, where Netherley was built in the 1960s using industrialised construction systems. The idea was efficiency. Prefabricated concrete panels slotted together on site to create maisonettes and low-rise blocks faster and cheaper than traditional brickwork. The panels were manufactured off-site and assembled like components. The system failed. Within years, the joints between panels leaked. Condensation saturated the interiors. Mould spread across walls and ceilings. Structural cracking appeared in blocks that were less than a decade old. Residents reported rain coming through sealed windows. Children developed respiratory problems. The estate sat on the southeastern fringe of Liverpool, miles from the city centre, connected by infrequent bus services that stopped running early in the evening. By the 1980s, Netherley was being demolished, not renovated, not upgraded, demolished. The construction system that was supposed to solve the housing crisis had produced homes unfit for habitation within a single generation. Residents who had moved from cramped terraces in the inner city found themselves in new builds that were colder, damper, and more dangerous than what they had left behind. Staying in Merseyside, we come to Kirkby. Before the war, Kirkby was a village of roughly 3,000 people. By the mid-1960s, the population had swollen to over 50,000. Liverpool Corporation had designated it as an overspill area and built thousands of council homes to house families cleared from inner-city slums. The plan depended on employment arriving alongside the housing. An industrial estate was built. Firms were recruited. For a time, factories like Bird's Eye and Kraft employed thousands. Then the closures began. Bird's Eye left. Kraft left. Others followed. The industrial estate that was supposed to sustain the town hollowed out. The residents remained, but the jobs did not. Kirkby sits roughly 6 miles northeast of Liverpool city centre. The rail connection exists, but the service frequency has never matched the population. The town centre, once anchored by a Tesco and a handful of shops, declined through the 2000s as retailers pulled out. Residents describe a generational experience of being promised something better and receiving something half-finished. The houses were built. The community infrastructure was not. Kirkby was a bedroom without a house. A few miles south in Knowsley Cantrell Farm became so notorious that it changed its name. Built in the 1960s as another Liverpool overspill estate, the design featured deck access maisonettes and interconnected walkways linking blocks at upper levels. The walkways were intended to create streets in the sky. What they created were corridors with no natural surveillance where crime flourished and residents felt trapped. The 1981 riots that swept Merseyside reached Cantrell Farm. By the mid-80s, the estate's reputation had become so damaging that a regeneration trust was established under Tom Barron, and the entire development was rebranded as Stockbridge Village. Deck access blocks were demolished. Traditional houses replaced them. The name changed on maps and bus routes and council documents. Residents remained divided on whether the new name changed anything real. The physical improvements were genuine. The worst blocks came down and better housing went up. But people who grew up there in the 1970s still call it Cantrell Farm. The name stuck because the experience stuck. A new sign on the road does not erase what happened behind the old one. We come now to the estates where isolation became something closer to abandonment. These are communities that were placed at the edges and then had the funding cut, the services withdrawn, and the attention diverted elsewhere. Wythenshawe in Manchester was supposed to be a garden city. In the 1920s, the planner Barry Parker designed a community of tree-lined avenues, neighbourhood centres, and green space. The vision was influenced by Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement. Homes surrounded by nature, communities built at human scale. What emerged over the following decades was something Parker would not have recognized. The post-war additions abandoned the Garden City principles. Dense housing blocks went up without the community facilities the original plan required. Wythenshawe grew into one of the largest council estates in Europe, stretching across roughly 11 square miles with a population exceeding 70,000. The Metrolink tram extension eventually arrived in 2014, decades after residents began asking for it. The Benchill ward within Wythenshawe was at one point ranked as the most deprived ward in England. Life expectancy figures for men in parts of Wythenshawe sat more than 10 years below the national average. The parks and trees from the Garden City era remain. You can walk through Wythenshawe Park and see what Parker intended. Then you cross the road and see what happened instead. East to Leeds, where Seacroft occupies the northeastern edge of the city like an afterthought. Built from the late 1950s through the 60s, the estate housed families cleared from back-to-back terraces in inner Leeds. Tower blocks went up. Low-rise maisonettes surrounded them. A shopping centre was built at the centre of the estate and named Seacroft Green. The towers have mostly come down now. Seacroft Green Shopping Centre declined through the 2000s as anchor tenants left. The estate sits roughly 4 miles from Leeds city centre, but there is no rail connection. Bus services run along York Road, but the journey is slow and the frequency drops sharply in the evening. Crime statistics for Seacroft consistently sit above Leeds averages. Life expectancy for men in the most deprived Seacroft wards runs several years below the city average. Community forums describe a specific kind of invisibility. People who live in the centre of Leeds have never visited Seacroft. They could not point to it on a map. It exists at the edge of their city, but outside their awareness entirely. South now, to a place that disrupts every assumption about where deprivation lives in this country. Lee Park sits in the borough of Havant in Hampshire. Hampshire, the county of Winchester Cathedral and New Forest ponies and test match cricket at the Agius Bowl. This is not where people expect to find one of the largest and most deprived council estates in southern England. Lee Park was built from 1947 to house families from Portsmouth, which had been heavily bombed during the war and needed to clear damaged housing stock. At its peak, Lee Park housed over 40,000 people across neighbourhoods called Warren Park, Stockheath and Barncroft. For years it had no railway station within the estate. Bus services to Portsmouth and Havant town centre were the only connections. The deprivation indices for Lee Park sit in the lowest deciles nationally, surrounded by some of the wealthiest communities in England. Educational attainment and employment rates track well below Hampshire averages. Health outcomes follow the same pattern. Residents describe an experience familiar from every estate on this list: the sense of being placed somewhere and forgotten. But in Lee Park, the forgetting is compounded by geography. When people think of Hampshire, they think of market towns and sailing clubs. They do not think of Lee Park. The estate is invisible inside its own county. We end in Glasgow. Easterhouse was built from the mid-1950s to clear the overcrowded tenements of the Gorbals. What the planners did not build tells the story. No pubs, no cinema, no community centre. The ideology held that families needed homes and nothing more. The distance from Glasgow city centre is roughly 6 miles. The bus journey took over 40 minutes. Residents describe growing up in Easterhouse as growing up in a separate town that happened to share a postcode with a city they rarely visited. Male life expectancy in parts of the estate has been measured at more than 15 years below the Scottish average. 15 years. Not a statistic. A generation of fathers who did not see their grandchildren. The residents who speak about Easterhouse, the ones who stayed, say something that runs through every estate on this list. They did not choose this. Someone in an office drew lines on a map and decided where they would live, how far from everything they would be, and how little they would be given. And then that someone went home to a house they chose for themselves, in a street with a pub and a shop, and a bus that came every 10 minutes. The plans are still in the archives. The signatures are still on the documents. The people who drew those lines never had to live inside them.